Hi, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. So first, welcome to our Lunch and Learn today, co-hosted with SilverLine Consulting and North Coast Ventures. My name is Alexis, and I am the Marketing and Community Manager at North Coast Ventures. For those of you not familiar with North Coast, we are based in Cleveland and are made up of over 300 individual investors in 6 separate funds. These funds include both angel funds and more traditional venture capital funds. We really feel that our strongest asset is the power of our network, and we heavily rely on our network to help identify, engage, and really accelerate high growth opportunities here in Northeast Ohio. This afternoon, Innovation Council partner SilverLine Consulting will be presenting how to adapt HR during COVID-19. At North Coast, we partner with organizations like SilverLine for our Innovation Council. Each of these corporate partners want to play a greater role in industry innovation by building relationships with North Coast portfolio companies and providing industry expertise, relevant services, and making connections for those companies that we work with and that we invest in. So Julie Brennan, president of SilverLine, will start the presentation in just a few minutes. She has more than 15 years experience in human resources, talent acquisition, and organizational development, spanning the technology, manufacturing, retail, and professional services industries. Her varied experience includes leading the people function in startup and high growth environments, Fortune 500 organizations, and most recently as a trusted advisor to her clients through SilverLine. As an active innovation council partner, SilverLine has led the searches and driven HR initiatives for a number of our portfolio companies. The CEOs of these companies speak very highly of Julie, which is why we're super excited to have her here with us today. Before Julie gets started, we wanted to share.
I found this on the web.
Oops, sorry, Siri. Before Julie gets started, we wanted to share that this session is being recorded and a video link will be shared with you all via email following the presentation. We'll also be taking questions throughout, so feel free to pop any questions you may have into the chat feature. In addition, Julie has very generously offered to conduct a quick 20 to 30 minute one-on-one consultation with anyone who would like to dive deeper into any of the topics that we cover or who has a specific question that we didn't get to address. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Julie.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here with you today. So a couple caveats, because that's what I do, I caveat. I can't cover all the topics that you wanted. There was a lot of interest in things that we just won't have time for today. So just to reiterate what Alexis just shared, I'm going to offer anyone that's on this call whose issue doesn't get addressed a free consultation. So some time with you to start problem solving whatever you might have, because today's focus is going to be on the lovely COVID-19. Number two, I have typically a conversational style, so it's a little weird to be presenting to completely muted people. So what you'll notice is we're going to stop frequently and just make sure that anyone that's saying anything in the chat is being heard. So please use that, because the way this will be the most valuable is if I'm responding to where you need me to. So I love memes. They make me happy. And so I'm going to share with you a few of my favorites in this time. And we'll just start off with a little light heart, because we could use a light heart in these days and times and when we're having to talk about HR and COVID. But this is one of my favorites because he's super handsome. And then I love this one. I hope you're laughing. I can't hear you, so I'm going to assume you are, and continue to be happy. And this one. That's not the drink I would choose, but you know. And this one of my favorites. I am wearing a bra for this session, so that's good. Hopefully all of you are as well if you need one. I do have sweatpants on. I do have sweatpants on as well. You just wouldn't know it from seeing my top half. I am not going to stand up during this session. So we're going to talk today about our new normal. And I'm breaking this into sort of two topics, or two kind of subtopics. The first is managing the impacts of COVID when you're in the workplace. So some of your businesses are probably back in the workplace, or if you were essential, never really stopped. Some of you are starting to think about, when do we go back, and when we do, what do we need to do? And some of you may be way past this. So hopefully I can meet you where you are and address the questions you would have. The second topic is about really being in a remote environment. Many of you are in a remote environment and will be there for a while. Hopefully not starting to look like Matthew McConaughey did in that first picture. So we're going to talk about how to keep people engaged and how to help them to the best of an employer's ability while they're stuck in remote land, or like some of my clients, they've decided to stay in remote land. So what does that look like? So those are our topics for today. So first, we're going to talk about returning to the office. Again, this is kind of workplace focused. Some policies we should consider, thinking about hiring someone you've never met, and then we'll stop and answer any questions or to talk about anything you want to talk about. So the first thing I want to say is, when you are coming back to the office, you need to set really clear expectations for employees on what you need them to do. Some of this is obvious, some of it's not. It might be wearing a mask, it might be the 6 foot distance. CDC has given you a lot of these things as employers. If you don't know where to go, I can point you to the sites that give you all the information. But the point is, when employees are going to start showing back up in your office, or if they're already there and you haven't done this yet, you need to tell them what you expect of them. So I'm going to show you an example. At Walsh University, they put out the 7 to remember. And so they're always talking about the 7 to remember. And while this is sort of a fun and lighthearted way to show you the things that we want employees at Walsh to do, it's the key things that are going to keep people healthy. So wearing your mask, washing your hands, sanitizing. So all of these things are, again, 6 feet apart. That's all the stuff they expect of their employees. Now this goes down a level, things like you're going to be 6 feet apart. And so if you're in a conference room and you can't be 6 feet apart, you can't have the meeting in that conference room. So all sorts of things like that. But really thinking about how you adhere to CDC guidelines and open your workplace up. And thinking about, do you need to offer any more safety, like the partitions or anything like that? So that's the first thing. Again, it's thinking about what guidelines you want your employees to follow, and being really clear about that. The second is situational guidelines. So on this slide, what you see is examples of all the freaking situations that can happen when employees start coming back to work. Some of you've probably already experienced some of these. These are just some of them. You have an employee with a confirmed case of COVID. You have someone with symptoms of COVID. You have someone with no symptoms, but they've been in close contact with someone who has COVID. They've been in non-close contact with someone who has COVID. I mean, it goes on and on. You've got employees who are saying, I really can't wear a mask. All sorts of things can come up, and you have to be ready with how to deal with them. So my suggestion is to be really proactive about this and determine the action plan and the leave plan under each scenario. And I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute. For those of you that have less than 500 employees in your workforce, which I'm sure most of you do, you're eligible for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And what that essentially means is there's availability for time off, paid time off, for those impacted by coronavirus in various ways, whether they have it, have to care for someone who has it, have to stay home because of lack of childcare. There's a bunch of different reasons. And if you pay and you provide this paid time off to those employees, you can be reimbursed for it. So that's important to know as you're thinking through the leave plan under each scenario, because some of that stuff will be covered for you. So I am going to show you an example of a document. And this document's really long and cumbersome, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But this is an example of a document that a client of mine uses every single time one of these scenarios comes up. It says what the situation is. So there's an employee with a confirmed COVID case. It says what the company action plan is. It's essentially getting the person out of there, letting HR or the CEO know. Then HR calls the employee to gather all the information they need, instructs them to self-quarantine, discusses their leave plan with them, then communicates to all of the people they came into contact with. Now, while your county will also do that, some employers are saying, hey, if there was someone sitting in a meeting with a person the day before, we're telling them right away so that they can also not come back to work. And then here, and in this case, this is a company that has over 500. This section just discusses what that person is eligible for so that every conversation that is had with every employee who has a confirmed COVID case ends up being the same conversation. So again, this is for example purposes. These instructions here aren't necessarily what would apply in your organization. The point here is to be really proactive and thinking about what could happen and how you're going to handle it so that you're not caught off guard and you don't feel out of control. Because it can, especially if you're a larger team, you get a couple of cases and it can start to feel overwhelming because this is not what we're typically in the business of doing. So before I move on, what questions have come up?
Hi, Julie. We have a question about hiring remotely. Is that something that you want to talk about now, or do you get to that later?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to cover it. I'll just jump into hiring remotely. Okay, so that's one of the topics I was going to cover here. And here's what I would say on it. Hiring remotely is something that a number of my clients are doing. I believe, Alexis, if at some point you want to jump in, I think you were hired at North Coast that way. My advice is this. Number one, build a thorough process. You probably had an interviewing process before all of this happened. Try to stick to it, but doing it over, Zoom. Consider various scenarios, having a number of one-on-one conversations with the candidate, and then maybe a panel or a couple of people talking to the person. Consider having the candidate present something to you, maybe do a case study or present something to you so you're seeing them kind of, speaking in a different way. A lot of my clients rely on getting candidates in a situation like taking them out for a drink or a meal or trying to make it casual so they get to know them. And while that still can be somewhat possible, you can do your best at creating a casual environment and letting the candidate know that's what you're trying to do, get to know them. It's going to be a little stilted. It's not going to be the same as in person. So some supplemental things that some of my clients are doing are considering doing a personality assessment. There's DISC profile. I work with Pradco a lot. They do a lot of pre-employment testing to make sure culturally a candidate will align. It's that kind of stuff that might help ease any concerns that you'd have about not meeting the person in person. And then thinking about for them, the person that has never seen your office, can you give them a virtual tour of your office or get into your office space when no one else is there or whatever, if you're not using it, take pictures, show them through a slideshow, let them see the workspace and what they can expect. Consider letting them talk to employees that have no weight in the interview process. Maybe people that have recently started, talking about what they like about being there, what it's really like to work there, a day in the life, that kind of thing, where maybe the candidate has the opportunity to interview employees to really understand what it's like to be an employee there. The last piece of advice I give is ask candidates along the way, like, how are you feeling? What are the barriers to you feeling good about this? What could we do understanding our virtual environment to help you feel more comfortable? And then when you actually make hires, ask those hires for feedback. How did it go? What would you have done differently? Kind of do a post-mortem on the hiring process so you can improve it as you continue hiring. So I'm going to stop talking at you and see, did I address the question that was raised, and is there any follow-ups? And I'll give you a minute to type if you need to.
A couple questions, Julie, have come through. So one are, what are some strategies for potential employee vetting for startups with limited funds? And I think you covered this off, but what should definitely be done by companies who are looking to hire remotely? And then there's also a question about policies, but I think,
Yep, I'm gonna jump into that next.
Okay, perfect.
I'm gonna jump into that next. The first question that you mentioned, something about limited funds. What, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question that came through the chat is, we are doing hiring for a couple important positions that will all be remote without meeting in person, and for people whose prior employment is at companies across the country, it feels harder to vet someone. What are some strategies for potential employee vetting for startups with limited funds? What should we definitely be doing?
Yeah, okay. So I would say for companies with limited funds, everything I just mentioned, with the exception of doing a formal assessment, is free, right? It's just something you have to orchestrate and think about and coordinate with your internal team, what questions you're going to ask and those kinds of things. So I would say those are all free, as free as any interview process is. I mean, you're spending people's time, but there is no cost to any of the things I mentioned. Alexis, anything else before I move on to policies?
I think the questions that we have are all about policies. So I'll ask those until.
Okay. So I'm going to jump back to some policies to consider. These are sort of the high level ones. So we'll talk about upon return. Again, we're kind of talking about when you're having people come back into the environment, you really need to think about your vacation and sick time implications. So if you're a small employer, keep in mind that the Families First Coronavirus Protection Act is an option to reimburse you for the cost of paid time related to coronavirus. So what you need to decide is if you want to do more than that. So to give you an example, under that act, an employee could get up to 80 hours of paid sick time due to having to quarantine. But what could happen is they may have to quarantine 3 times over the course of a year. So what happens then? That's up to you, right? So I can tell you what I think, but the thing is, it's situationally driven. You may be able to let that person work from home, and it may be completely unimpactful whatsoever, but it's thinking about those things ahead of time. If you're not eligible for that Protection Act, then it's thinking about, okay, what are we willing to spend? And it's not an extra cost. It's just it's payroll in lieu of work. What are we willing to spend for people who they and their families are impacted by the coronavirus? And so what COVID time are we going to offer? I would say those are the biggest things when you're thinking about the person coming back to work. And every environment's going to be a little different based on what the person's job is. Can they work from home? Are they public facing? Are they essential? There's all sorts of implications. So it's not a one size fits all answer, unfortunately. This is where, if you need me after this call, you can reach out. And then for remote workers, and we're going to talk a lot more about remote and how to make that as good as possible. But for remote workers, the policies to be thinking about or approaches is first expenses. So if you were a workforce that wasn't remote at all, or very rarely was remote before all this went down, what are you reimbursing your people for? I have a lot of clients that are reimbursing them for nothing because they were all able to work and regularly worked anywhere before coronavirus hit. But for some employers, believe it or not, I do have some clients where people don't have laptops, or, they don't have a cell phone per se that is work covered. So thinking about what's the appropriate thing to do. Taking the word policy out of it and talking more about approach, I think important things to think about are communication and what's the cadence going to be. I have a lot of companies doing a morning stand-up with their teams. So while you might not be able to do that with your whole company based on its size, departments might be able to do that. Department leads might be able to do that, or the whole company can jump on the call. It's it's about controlling that call and setting an agenda. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Keeping everyone on the same page, but making sure that there's really good, really strong communication, because we can't get up and walk to each other's desks anymore. And then setting some standards for your company on etiquette when it comes to Zoom, Slack, email. So like I mentioned earlier, I have sweatpants on. You might not appreciate that if the person, again, hopefully they're not standing up if they do, but what is it that you need if the person is interacting with an external client base from your company? Do you expect them to not look like they rolled out of bed? Do you expect them to have professional attire on? Whatever that might be. Everyone could probably, and here's the thing, some of this I would say is dated in the fact that we've been at it for a while and a lot of people have figured this out, but how not to share the screens you don't want to share. I've had clients with sort of horror stories of chats going on about someone who's presenting, and don't any of you dare do that. And then the screen being shared and the person presenting being able to see it. Just all sorts of oops. But just what are the basic expectations? When do you want your people available? You must be available to answer a Zoom call between the hours of blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to talk about flexibility separately, but some jobs are just going to have a requirement being really clear about what you expect. So those would be some of the policy approach-esque kind of things that I would encourage you to be thinking about. I'm going to pause and see, are there any questions or follow-ups?
The questions that we have in the chat are related to paid sick leave as well as PPP loans. Do you want to talk about those now, or do you want to wait?
We can talk about both of those now. Why don't you read the full question to me?
Sure. So the first one, have issues come up for companies who take PPP loans, then don't get financially assisted with time off for COVID purposes?
Not in my experience. It's not something I can speak to specifically. I don't see why a company, my understanding is, and I have clients where this has happened, they've taken PPP loan assistance and also qualify for the Families First Coronavirus Act, because it's feeding two totally different financial streams. But that's all I can say about that. My apologies. Again, I'll take a follow-up on it if whoever asked that has a follow-up. And on the paid sick leave, Alexis?
Yeah, so since the paid sick leave in EFMLA under the FFCRA expires at the end of the month, what is your advice on a policy for companies that have utilized this for next year?
So say it again.
Sure. So since the paid sick leave in EFMLA under the FFCRA expires at the end of the month, what is your advice on a policy for companies that have utilized this for next year?
So I would say it's probably there's gonna be something released next year, in my opinion, no doubt. So I would think that it will become moot in 2021. We'll end up having a similar approach to 2020. Outside of that, if you are a company that is big enough to offer FMLA, and for those of you that don't know much about the Family Medical Leave Act, and that's an act that's out there, this is regardless of Corona, that gives employers with 50 or more employees the ability, gives them, I guess, it gives the employee the right to have up to 12 weeks unpaid time to care for themselves or a loved one with a serious medical condition. So in lieu of government renewing the Family First Act for 2021, companies who have FMLA eligibility would be able to let their employees use those 12 weeks for any COVID related issues. So that was a lot of ACT discussion. If there's a follow-up question, I'll certainly take it. Is there anything else in there right now, Alexis?
Nope, those were the 2 questions in the chat for right now.
Okay. All right. So, and the other takeaway from this slide before I move on is don't walk down the street without your pants on. Don't forget to put your pants on. Okay. So now we're going to shift to the topic of being remote and having a workforce that is largely remote, fully remote, going to be remote indefinitely. So we've got people dealing with kids. We've got people dealing with just being down and not excited about this anymore, struggling to stay focused. We've got really good performers that you trust, and we've got really not good performers that you don't trust. And so it's like, and then you also have the person who, and this is probably many of us can relate to this, is just stressed. And that can ebb and flow between, just being isolated or feeling isolated, feeling like they're not productive and not feeling great about that, feeling pulled in a million directions, or being scared about their own or a loved one's health. So you've got like all these dynamics going on in this workforce that you're not seeing. Then you've got parents, and this isn't to say that those that are not parents aren't dealing with a ton of stuff, because they are. But when you do have your parent situations, you've got lots of kids at home. And there was a study done by Boston Consulting Group that found that 60% of parents who had childcare before coronavirus have been unable to find an alternative. And I will tell you, because I have had to continue to travel over the last 6 months, and Ohio is one of the most lax states, believe it or not. I was in California a couple of times, and I mean, nannies aren't going back into the homes of the children they used to care for. They're staying home. So, this, while it might not seem as abundant as often for us, or we might not be hearing about it as much, this is a real issue. So you can see these stats here. 60% of respondents have no outside help in caring for their children. Parents are now spending 27 hours each week on more stuff than they did before in the house. Mothers and fathers are having to step up, but the burden is statistically on the mom. And 50% of workers in this study felt that their performance at work has decreased. And I think most people, if being honest with themselves, would say that the impact has not necessarily made things better at work. So this puts the onus on us to keep people engaged and to do our best to motivate them and support them through this and meet them where they are. So my goal today is to give you ideas. And I'm not going to solve all your problems, that's for sure. And if you've got a really tough one and you want to talk about it after, again, that's my offer to you. But hopefully you can take a nugget away from this conversation. So the first thing is, that's not even on this slide, be real. What are you dealing with on a day-to-day basis? And assume your team is too. If you're feeling crappy, assume there's times your team is too. Just because you have a team member who's a single male doesn't mean that he's not bored out of his mind when he's not working and feeling very isolated. Maybe that individual didn't get together with anyone for Thanksgiving and they're just down. So there's all sorts of different, reasons why someone might not be being their best self. So how do you show up and keep them engaged in the work that you want them to do? So first, I would suggest ask them what they need. This can be the casual conversation one-on-one between supervisor and employee, where you're just talking about how are you and what do you need and what can we be doing to help you. If you have a sizable workforce, I would say 15 or more, do a survey. Ask them what do they wish? And there's a lot of different ways to ask the questions, but what do they wish the employer was doing that the employer isn't? And that doesn't mean that the employer is going to wave a magic wand and everything's going to be okay, but it'll at least help you, if you don't know right now, understand where your people are. And then keeping a really good communication cadence. So I mentioned the daily stand-up. That's a great idea. Having all of the people that have direct reports on your teams, make sure they're checking in on a regular basis with their people. You may say, I want you, in lieu of a formal meeting, talking to each person on your team once a day, whatever it is, but just so that there's constant contact. And then setting really clear expectations. Again, we're going to talk about flexibility in a minute, but being really clear about what the hours are, what the responsibilities are, and where you can and cannot be flexible. So sometimes you can be very flexible and it is all about just getting the job done. And sometimes your employee needs to be available, Pacific time between such and such an hour to another hour, and that is that. And you need to be really clear about that. So those would be some things to kind of set the stage on this topic. The next thing would be to consider ways to bring your team together. Whether it's taking a company break, and when I say company break, that could be a company break where you all jump on a Zoom for 15 minutes and you laugh about something. It could be where you say, you know what, from 1 to 1:30 every day, everyone's on break. And I'd really love it if you, make an attempt to do something physical, get out and take a walk, whatever, just kind of like really showing the employees, your team, that you understand that wellness is important. Telling them they can have an hour a day in the middle of the day to work out. Maybe that won't work for you, but maybe you say, as a team, from now on, everyone can shut down from 12 to 1 and have an hour to work out. I've had some clients do some virtual happy hours. Some love it, and a lot of that is just based on their team dynamic, like they have a lot of fun together, and some hate it and feel like it's forced fun. So you have to decide for yourself what will work in your environment. I have a client who has an expectation that every employee have coffee over Zoom with a coworker that you don't normally work with, and they do a little to facilitate that. But the whole point is, just chatting with them. What do you do? What are you working on? What are you struggling with? How's life for you? Just getting to know them. It forms empathy. It forms understanding, and it also makes you feel like you're not alone. Some companies doing some kid-friendly activities. I had a couple of companies do like a Halloween dress-up Zoom. So all the kids dressed up, parents introduced their kids said what they were dressed up as and why. And it was just kind of a way for parents to be able to see who else might be dealing with a little bit of a shit show at home. And also, it was a good way for, it to be lighthearted even for people that aren't parents. Some clients of mine are connecting parents or like-minded groups through a Slack channel. So, those that are trying to homeschool and work, those kinds of things. Before I get into flexibility, I'm going to take a pause. Is there any questions? Alexis.
We don't have anything in the chat, but I was just going to give it a second.
Give it a second. Yeah.
Types one in.
Yeah.
I think we can go ahead and move on. And if anyone has a question on any of these topics, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation.
Okay, sounds good. So I would encourage you to be open to flexibility and what that looks like. And I see it all. I have clients that really don't care at all when their people are working. What they care about is results. And I have clients who are regularly worried that their people are slacking off during work hours and, everything in between. So I would start with asking your team what they need. I would think about what's required. It goes back to this earlier slide. What's required to get the job done, and where can you and can't you be flexible and being honest about that? And where you can, think about, could our start hours or end hours be different? How could schedules be different? Could parents potentially be able to start earlier or work later and get their kids off the bus and handle like the next 2 hours when they get off the bus. If they're right now, there's probably no one at school. Somehow mine still are, but there's not very many people at school. So, how do you work with a parent that's trying to do both so that they feel supported by you and productive when they're working? I've heard a lot of parents working in shifts. One is taking the early shift and one is taking the late shift. How does that work in your, environment? Would it work in your environment? And remembering that parents aren't the only ones that have needs. And parents are the highlight because they're the ones that you're worried about their productivity because they have a lot of distractions right now. But there are other, like we talked about, there's other stressors that are creating, barriers to employees getting things done in the way they used to. So the point is working with your employees in a reasonable way to create a schedule that works for them and gets you what you need to. And just knowing that you care enough to think through this will go a long way. So at least that's what I have found. So along with that, I would say do kind stuff. If you're needing it, they need it too. So I've seen things like saying, offering a wellness day once every couple of months, offering a wellness stipend that the person can use to go take a yoga class or pay for a counseling appointment or get a massage, encouraging time off if you're noticing your team is stressed, if you are noticing an individual seems overwhelmed, acknowledging it and telling them to take a day off and that you support them and then you'll fill in for them. Check in frequently. We talked about communication cadence. I can't emphasize that enough. Get them to open up, which only happens with trust. And if you don't have that kind of relationship, it only happens over time. But it comes from things like asking them what their aspirations are, how they're really doing, what are the barriers that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis to getting their work done, just how are they? And likely opening up about where your vulnerabilities are as well will help, them do the same. Then when they talk to you about them, listening and confirm that you heard them. So it's so common when we are, especially managers, and we're trying to get a lot of things done that we're half in a conversation and half out of it. And when the person is telling us the answer to the question we've asked, we're already thinking of our next question, or we're answering an email or writing a grocery list or trying to get a kid to go get out of the screen. So what I will say is, when you're hearing something important and personal from one of your employees, say back to them after they've said it to you, what they've said. So, okay, Sam, here's what I think you said. Saying back to him what you think you heard and asking, did I get that right? So that individual feels heard. And I know that seems so basic, but that simple interaction helps with someone feeling supported. And when I feel supported, I'm more engaged and willing to do good work for my employer. Provide recognition when it's due, not so freely that it becomes contrived, but provide recognition for people in team meetings. And send thank you notes. And I would encourage you to send handwritten thank you notes to show up at their house because people like mail now. So send them a handwritten thank you note that shows you really recognize they did something that was meaningful. So I'm going to stop. What questions are there?
We don't have anything in the chat as of right now.
Okay. So as Alexis said at the beginning of the call, and I'll give you guys a couple of minutes if you have anything you do want to throw into the chat on the topics that we've covered. You, first of all, feel free. We have time for any questions that you have that were not covered today. I also want to mention that in the survey that we sent, there were 3 sort of separate topics that came up pretty frequently. And they were handbooks, performance management, and diversity and inclusion. And so what I would say to you is, there was no way to throw all of that into a lunch session and have it be meaningful. So if there's something burning in your organization or a problem you need solved, that's where you can utilize me after this call. And I'm going to put up my contact information, and you can feel more than welcome to email me after this call, and we'll set something up to dive deeper into the topics we've covered at a high level today, or any other things as it relates to sort of HR needs. And you can take me up on that free consultation. So anything else you would like to discuss or questions that you need answered?
I think we're all set, Julie. Everyone in attendance, as I mentioned, this session was recorded and will be shared with you via a link through email. So feel free to take Julie up on her offer for this consultation. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her directly. Otherwise, thank you all so much for your participation in this session, and hope you have a good rest of the week.
Thank you for participating, everyone.
Thanks so much,
have a good
Julie.
day. Put your pants on.